So this presentation is on causes of fatigue. There are many causes of fatigue. One cause of fatigue is due to a buildup of lactic acid. An example of when this could happen is if you're working at a high intensity for a long period of time, so such as a 400-meter sprint. This happens due to the byproduct that is created when using the lactic acid system, which is lactic acid. This causes pain receptors, which will cause us pain. It also inhibits the enzymes production, which break down fuels such as glycogen and glucose, which causes us to fatigue. Another cause of fatigue is different muscle fiber types. So the rate that slow oxidative muscle fiber types fatigue is a lot slower than the rate of like fast glycolytic muscle fibers. So if you were a 100-meter sprinter and you were competing in a long run, like a 5-mile run, you'll fatigue quicker because you have a bigger percentage of fast glycolytic muscle fibers, whereas if you were a marathon runner and you were taking part in a 100-meter sprint, you'd fatigue a lot quicker as well due to the high percentage of slow oxidative muscle fibers. A vascular shunt is another cause for fatigue, as an athlete will have eaten maybe too close to their exercise session, for example a long cycle. So blood is then distributed to major organs to digest the food that's eaten instead of to working muscles, causing them not to be supplied with oxygen and nutrients, causing us to fatigue. Another cause of fatigue, a main one, is the energy stores depletion, such as creatine and glycogen. Creatine will deplete after around 10 seconds due to small stores, whereas glycogen can last for a longer period of time but will fatigue eventually when the stores run out. So, for example, a 10-second activity could be a 100-meter sprint. So Usain Bolt does it in just under 10 seconds. So at the end of the sprint, he will have a shortage of creatine supply. Then glycogen, for example, could be a long cycle, a long run, where you're working at a steady state, but then eventually your stores will run out. So our first section is on creatine. Creatine is used when we're doing like an 8 to 10 second exercise, but is used like whenever you start exercising. So up until the first 10 seconds, you're using your creatine stores. So when we exercise, when we start, we have ATP, which creates the movement in muscles. We then have to resynthesize that ATP as it runs out. So our first our energy store is used as creatine. This then resynthesizes the ATP, causing us to create the movement at our muscles. So creatine stores are very small, as they allow us to achieve maximal exercise such as a 100-meter cycle or sprint, yet cannot sustain for a long period of time because of the small stores. An example of this is the Wingate test. As you can see here on this screen, there is a Wingate. These are the Wingate test fatigue index with all the students below. As you can see, on the PowerPoint, there is a graph showing how different students fatigued over 30 seconds. We can compare Charlie White, which is here, who had a fatigue index of 80%, to Ellis Chapman here, who had a fatigue index of 40%. So from this we can sort of assess this and think, because Charlie had a larger fatigue index, it's likely that he doesn't have as bigger store of creatine. So this caused him to fatigue quicker, as he had to change to a different energy system to resynthesize the ATP. Whereas Ellis Chapman must have a larger store of creatine, as he sustained the 30-second Wingate test without fatiguing as much. The larger the store of creatine, the longer you can exercise at these maximal levels. So such as sprinters, 100-meter sprinters will want larger stores of creatine, as then they can exercise for the whole like 10, 12 seconds of their race using their creatine system and don't have to use their lactic acid system, as they will have to, they won't be able to work as hard using the lactic acid system. So as you can see on the screen, there are supplements people take to increase the stores of creatine. They're called creatine monohydrate. So creatine monohydrate helps increase the stores of creatine, allowing us to exercise using our creatine system or exercising maximally for long periods of time. The supplement allows us to reduce fatigue as stores are larger, helping us to resynthesize ATP for a longer time. So a lot of bodybuilders take creatine as they're doing they're not exercising for long periods of time, and then the creatine can resynthesize and replenish itself. So then for the next set of exercises, they'll have their stores resynthesized. So glucose and glycogen. During the use of the lactic acid system and the aerobic system, glucose and glycogen is used to resynthesize ATP, creating the movement that is necessary in muscles, for example, cycling over a long distance. As glycogen levels deplete in our liver, so do glucose. This is because during submaximal exercise, such as a half marathon, our energy stores start to deplete as we do not have an endless store of glucose and glycogen in the body. As you can see from this graph, that when we first start exercising, we have 100% of our glycogen stores. Over a period of time, such as 3 hours, we're left with 20% of glycogen stores. This shows you how it depletes over a shorter period of time when compared to creatine. So, once glucose and glycogen stores are fully depleted, hyperglycemia may kick in. This is also known as hitting the wall. This is where an athlete may feel very dizzy and hallucinate. They'll be very fatigued, and athletes often collapse due to hyperglycemia. If stores deplete and an athlete does hit the wall, then our bodies will try and find a different form of glucose. For example, breaking down muscle protein, causing a muscle atrophy. This is where sort of our muscles will get smaller due to them being used to create glucose and glycogen. This is known as gluconeogenesis, and our bodies really do not adapt well to this, as the muscle protein breaking down just doesn't really help our bodies. It can sort of be quite painful when they make an athlete fatigue. So, however, there is a way of preventing the depletion of glucose and glycogen stores, such as glucose drinks, as you can see on the screen, gels and sweets. These can be taken prior to an event, such as a half marathon, or can be taken whilst running the half marathon to top up stores before they run out. If you top up these stores, then fatigue will be prevented, and so will hyperglycemia. Another technique is carbo loading, where you deplete your glycogen and glucose levels about 3 days before your event, such as the half marathon, and then top them up so they're fully topped up before the race. So this would be eating lots of carbs, so foods such as pasta, rice and sweet potatoes are great carbs and will help to load up your glucose and glycogen levels. So this will therefore leave you with larger levels of glucose and glycogen to prevent fatigue. Carbo loading can be combined with the pre-event or mid-event high glucose drinks, gels and sweets. This will give you optimum levels of glucose and glycogen stores. So CO2 can cause us to fatigue. CO2 is produced in the muscles as a waste product of the aerobic energy system. As muscles work harder, the CO2 production in muscles increases. The CO2 is therefore diffused into capillaries. The capillaries will then flow back to the alveoli for diffusion to take place. This is where the CO2 can be expired, as the CO2 will diffuse into the alveoli and the oxygen will diffuse from the alveoli into the capillaries. When the CO2 increases in the muscles, chemoreceptors will detect this. They will detect the acidity of the blood increasing. They will then send an impulse to the respiratory control center, where an impulse is then sent to the SA node. This will then speed up our heart rate, so we can pump the blood around the body, diffuse the CO2 faster, and breathing rate will increase to expire the CO2 at a faster rate. CO2 is transported in the blood in 3 different ways. One is carbaminohemoglobin, which carries 23% of CO2. Plasma, this carries 3% of CO2. And carbonic acid, which transports the bulk of the CO2, with 70% of the CO2 being carried in carbonic acid. CO2 can cause us to fatigue. We cannot expire the CO2 out of our body. Then we will have to increase our breathing rate and our heart rate so the CO2 can be transported to the alveoli at a faster rate, and then we can expire it faster. As breathing rate and heart rate increase, so will the production of CO2 as our muscles are working harder. For example, during a 1500-meter race, as the production of CO2 keeps increasing, we will be unable to remove all of the waste products, and this may cause us to fatigue. So lactic acid. Whilst using the lactic acid system, a byproduct or waste product is produced called lactic acid. Glycogen is broken down by glycogen phosphorylase to form glucose, which is broken down by an enzyme called phosphofructokinase to form pyruvate acid. During this process, lactic acid is formed as a byproduct of the energy system. Lactic acid inhibits the production of the enzymes such as glycogen phosphorylase and phosphofructokinase. This can cause us to fatigue, as we will not be able to sustain the intensity of the exercise, preventing the enzymes to be reproduced because the lactic acid inhibits the reproduction of them. Lactic acid also triggers pain receptors when it's released in the bloodstream. This makes us feel like a burning, painful sensation in the working muscles. However, the heart does use lactic acid as a fuel, which is a good aspect of lactic acid. When we reach our OBLA, which are onset blood lactate accumulation, our blood lactate is too high to sustain the exercise and we'll have to stop. If not, we will fatigue a lot. When this happens, it can be used to determine the speed we would have to run a marathon, and usually we reach our OBLA at 85% of our VO2 max. So heat can cause us to fatigue whilst we exercise. Heat is released from our muscles when we contract. Our bodies they're quite inefficient and only use 20% of the heat from exercising, meaning we waste 80% of our heat. This means most heat is dissipated and wasted. When we sweat during exercise, this releases the heat as the sweat collects the heat and evaporates, taking it with it. However, if you exercise in a humid climate where there's a lot of water in the air, then the sweat will not be able to evaporate, meaning the heat cannot be released, increasing our body temperature. When exercising to release heat, the hairs on our arms and legs will flatten to release hot air. Blood will also be distributed to skin surface to cool the skin and bring body temperature down to homeostasis. Whilst we breathe, a small portion of heat is also lost. If our body temperature changes a few degrees below or above homeostasis, then we can die of heat exhaustion and hypothermia. If the cooling mechanisms cannot cool the body due to humidity or air temperature, we'll become dehydrated, and if your body is telling you that you're dehydrated through sort of a headache or dry mouth and feeling a bit drowsy and feel like you could pass out, then it's normally too late and you need to cool down and get some fluids in to rehydrate you. This will cause us to fatigue, as we'll be working towards heat exhaustion, which has some very serious effects on the body, such as death. So an example of where this might happen is in football. When the football season's finished and you're playing in summer tournaments, it can be very hot. The tournament matches are only for short periods of time. But during these short periods of time when it's summer, body temperature can increase a lot. So the next section is acetylcholine depletion. So acetylcholine is used to transmit the nerve impulses sent from the brain to conduct muscular contractions over the receptor sites. If not enough acetylcholine is transmitted for the threshold, then the nerve impulses will not be able to be transported over the receptor sites. Then the impulse cannot be sent, causing us to be unable to make the muscular contraction. Cholinesterase breaks down the acetylcholine that has made the impulse travel over the receptor sites. If there is not enough cholinesterase, then the acetylcholine won't be cleared properly, causing the nerve impulse to be sent ineffectively. This can cause us to fatigue as the nerve impulses won't be sent properly, causing the muscular contractions to be inefficient. So as these stores of cholinesterase are depleted, then the contractions cannot be made, which will cause us to fatigue.